Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. How does India manage its national security? What are the various institutions, individuals and structures that make up India's national security system? What are the reforms that are required at this point of time to better manage our national security system? To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Dr. Arvind Gupta. Dr. Arvind Gupta is the director of the Vivekananda International Foundation based in Delhi. He is a former Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of India and a former Secretary, National Security Council Secretariat. He was also the Director General of the Institute of Defence Studies and Analysis, that is IDSA, from 2012 to 2014. But the reason why I have requested Dr. Gupta to come to the studio to discuss national security with me is because I happened to read this very interesting book recently published by Dr. Gupta on how India manages its national security. It's a fantastic book. You should all read this. This actually is a very fine introduction to India's national security. Welcome to National Security Conversation, Dr. Gupta, and congratulations on this excellent book. Can we start by introducing your book to the viewers by way of telling what are the key features and the key arguments of this book?
Well, I think you covered some of it in your very nice introduction. India faces multiplicity of national security challenges, and it has been so since 1947 when we became independent. And now we have a national security environment of India that is changing in many different ways. Now, in order to deal with these challenges, since we became independent, India has set up a wide variety of national security management institutions. So India has a huge national security management institutions. It's even difficult to count how many agencies that we have. So this book is an introduction to the national security management system of India, and looks at various institutions like the armed forces, the police, the technology institutions and so on. And I had some thing to do with, as a member of the National Security Council Secretariat, I had some experience of looking at those problems. So I thought that outside the government, while there is of course a debate on national security, but the nitty-gritty of these institutions is not often well understood. So I have written a primer, you could call it, a simple introduction to the national security management system, where I have tried to bring in as many organizations as I could think of, bring them together and look at their issues, and also see how in the overall context of India's national security, how are they functioning? Are they able to perform their functions? What is it that we need to do? And that's where the reform, etc. comes in.
That's right. Can we talk a little bit on the National Security Council, the role of the National Security Council in managing India's national security and its relationship with the Cabinet Committee on Security? You mentioned both in the book, but I'd like to sort of you to discuss the relationship between these two.
The need for National Security Council has been mentioned for many decades. In fact, in 1972, Mr. K. Subramaniam, late K. Subramaniam, he had spoken about the need for a National Security Council, but it was not set up. And it was the first time that it was set up was in 1990 when Mr. V.P. Singh was the Prime Minister, but it never met. So you had some thinking, you had some institution, but strangely it never met at that point of time. The situation changed in 1998 when we had India conducting the nuclear tests. And then India became a nuclear power, and we had to be behaving like a responsible nuclear power. And nuclear, as you know, we became a nuclear power as a result of very rapid changes in our national security environment. So the thinking again was that we should set up a body, which was the National Security Council. We should look at the national security in a holistic fashion. And that is how, by an executive order, National Security Council was set up in 1999. Since then, we have now been, this institution has been evolving. It is not only National Security Council, which is a political body headed by the Prime Minister, but there are associated institutions like the National Security Council Secretariat, National Security Advisory Board, the Strategic Planning Group, etc. These institutions are actually functioning as we speak. So it has been evolving, and I think the need for this was, as I said, to look at national security in a holistic fashion. And that was also the time, and I think last 20 years or so, all over the world, in the think tank circuits, in the governments, people have felt that it's not just the traditional security that we have to deal with, we also have to deal with non-traditional security issues, say for instance terrorism, say for instance drug trafficking, or the water security issues, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many dimensions to national security that we have to today look at, and National Security Council does that.
What is the need for a National Security Council when you already have a Cabinet Committee on Security, given the fact that Cabinet Committee on Security probably supersedes the National Security Council?
Actually, the Cabinet Committee on Security, CCS as we call it, and National Security Council have exactly the same membership. So it's a valid question. It's why is it that we require two different institutions? But the way we have evolved in this country in terms of our governance and the way the government functions, Cabinet Committees on Security is ultimately a decision-making organization. So the way our cabinet functions is that there is those issues where normally a minister is able to take a decision in a department. But there are some issues, as for instance many times in the case of national security issues, which concern more than one ministry, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ministries. Now that kind of so the decisions have to be taken by the Cabinet Committee on Security, but before that it is one department, say Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Defence or some other ministry, which prepares a note, and it is essentially a decision making note. You do not in that note discuss, say, what is going to be 20 years from now the national security environment, or what is it that we should do for future planning. Now National Security Council, which is not a decision making body, which is actually an advisory body, that has the time and luxury to look at these issues in a more detailed manner, in a more concentrative manner, and then identify what needs to be done. And once it identifies what needs to be done, then it goes back to the various ministries, etc., for making specific plans, strategies, etc., and come up for policy decisions. So in short, Cabinet Committee on Security takes the decisions which are related to, say, financing, which are related to our strategy, etc., but strategy making itself, that is something the National Security Council does.
But given the fact that you correctly pointed out and also written in this book that the membership of the committee and the council are one and the same, hypothetically speaking, if supposing we do not have the National Security Council, we have the Cabinet Committee on Security and the National Security Council Secretariat, the NSAB, etc., would there be a problem? Why do we need to have this extra?
It is the process. It is, supposing tomorrow you tell me, let us produce a strategy, a national security strategy. Now there is no one department in the government which can produce national security strategy, because since national security is a multidisciplinary process, so it is the National Security Council Secretariat, in consultations with the others, will produce a national security strategy, which will then go to the National Security Council, and which will look at it, yes, this is how it should be, it should not be, maybe this should be added, maybe more consultations are required, and then it may come back. But when it comes to actually taking a decision, now okay, you have a national security strategy which will be approved by the National Security Council, but when it comes to taking specific decisions, so making a strategy, taking a long-term view and strategic thinking, that is why this institution, which includes, as I said, not just the National Security Council as a top body, but other associated institutions, that is where that process is done. The Cabinet Committee Security process is entirely different from the National Security Council process. So process is also important.
Right. On page 70 of your book, Dr. Gupta, you say that the National Security Council and its structures do not find a mention in the government of India's allocation of business rules, because the government generally does not function on the basis of overarching institutions. This anomaly needs to be corrected. So are you saying that the government of India's allocation of business rules need to be amended in order to give more teeth to the NSC?
When the government was set up, say in 1960s, the allocation of business rules, transaction of business rules, etc. were formed at that point of time. We simply had ministries at that point of time. So you said, all right, this is what the MOD will do, this is what X department will do, this is what X agency will do, and these are very well laid down. That is how the siloed structure of the government came in. But these issues, which required many ministries to work together, this is a much later innovation. And this is also, many countries did not have National Security Council, but in the last 15-20 years, something like 50-60 countries have set up the National Security Councils. We did not think at that point of time that non-traditional security issues will become part of security. Say food and water, even today in our system, is being dealt with by concerned ministries. But so that will not even ever go to a Cabinet Committee on Security. But the security dimension of water shortages, that is something, who will think about it? You needed an institution, and that is what National Security Council does. And hence, since National Security Council was not mentioned in the allocation of business rules, so you have a situation where you have the departments, but you have a body which is thinking multidisciplinary and bringing in coordination is not mentioned that. I think that anomaly needs to be corrected.
But there was a recent announcement and the creation of a defense planning committee. Does that body dilute the significance and importance of the National Security Council?
No, not necessarily, because you see, National Security Council by its very nature will have a very wide remit, because it picks up an issue and it brings any number of bodies, both within the government and outside the government also, they can all be brought together. So this, I think you were mentioning, referring to the DPC. DPC is looking at issues of defense planning. That is what it is looking at, and is looking at a few ministries like MOD, MEA, Ministry of Finance, etc. Now all these bodies are already represented in National Security Council, and the National Security Council Secretariat also deals with it, and National Security Advisor is the head of that DPC. So it can very well be fitted into the overall National Security Council because of the great flexibility that National Security Council has in terms of picking up its subjects and in terms of bringing people together.
But given the fact that we already have a National Security Council, was there a need for a new DPC to be put in place?
I think DPC, in my view, has come about because there is the urgency of defense reforms. We had set up an IDS some years ago, and IDS was the body which was supposed to bring in synergy, etc., and look at some of these reforms. But IDS by itself couldn't do it, and it required certain other ministries, etc. So it's a very specific body with the 3 or 4 I think working groups which have been set up. Now NSA is in charge, so NSA has the overall view of national security also. So I think they can function it. It in no way contradicts, and in fact it will work in conjunction with National Security Council Secretariat or anybody else it wants to work with, including the think tanks if it wants to.
You know, the way K.C. Pant task force in the late 1990s had imagined the National Security Council system and the National Security Advisor was slightly different. The K.C. Pant committee task force had actually suggested that the National Security Advisor should have the rank of a cabinet minister. But as it stands today, the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council have not been given any legal or constitutional imprimatur. The National Security Advisor derives his power from the proximity to the Prime Minister. Now, the National Security Advisor is de facto the security czar of the country. Is it a good idea to have so much power vested in one person who has not been given the constitutional and the legal imprimatur. Now, you yourself mentioned in the book that the NSA is a single point national security advisor to the government of India. He heads the National Intelligence Board, the executive branch of the Nuclear Command Authority, and often invited to Cabinet Committee on Security meetings. Now, all of this is happening without any legal or constitutional provision. Is there a problem there? Should that be corrected?
Please remember that National Security Advisor is also only advisor. As I mentioned earlier, the actual decision will be taken by the Cabinet Committee on Security through the system of departmental notes and ministerial approvals, etc. If I need, let's say, additional resources for a ministry, now whether we require or we don't require is something that can be discussed in a multidisciplinary platform where National Security Advisor and his associated structures can discuss this, and then it can make a recommendation, advice to the government. Look, we need this strategy. Say for instance, in the case of Indian Ocean, let us say, Indian Ocean strategy, we have discussed this in the National Security Council, etc. But once you want to now implement that, all right, which countries you want to have a cooperation with, where do you want to build ports, what will be the shape of the Navy, etc. After having given the advice, this will go back to the Ministry of Defence and the Navy and so on and so forth. So they will take that advice and that they convert it into the implementable decisions, which will again go to the Cabinet Committee on Security. So National Security Advisor cannot order a particular ministry do this or do that.
I agree, but Dr. Gupta, the reality is that the National Security Advisor today coordinates among various agencies.
But that was
he negotiates with various countries. He is a special envoy to various countries. So he is someone who is in charge of a lot of things. Why not have this person or this post be given legal and constitutional imprimatur?
See, this is a system which is evolving. This is a system which is evolving. We are experimenting with it, and who knows what will happen in the future. This has been debated and discussed many times. Some people have said that why should there not be a ministry for national security? Mr. N.N. Vora talked about in, I think, one of his lectures in some last year. So these are systems which will evolve, and I think we should really take that system which is the most, which is suitable for us. So let us hope, because 20 years we have been evolving, we may take some more time.
Let's look at the NSC once again. You do mention in your book that the National Security Council is rarely used, and for that matter, even the Cabinet Committee on Security is not something that meets very regularly. So if the Cabinet Committee on Security and the National Security Council do not meet very often, does that lead to some kind of an ad hoc national security decision making in the country? I do understand the evolving part of it, but it is important to discuss about these things so that the corrections can be made.
One, I think Cabinet Committee on Security meets far more regularly than actually the people know. In fact, the meetings take place probably every month or maybe twice a month, or depending upon what is the need. Because there is a large number of decisions which need to be taken by the various ministries. So it is not true that Cabinet Committee on Security does not meet. In my experience, I think yes, National Security Council meets less frequently than has been the case with the Cabinet Committee on Security. And I write in the book also that I think there is a need for a greater activism of the National Security Council, because this is a body, in fact, it does not meet under the pressure of taking a decision. And that gives it a chance to look at issues in a little bit more relaxed manner in a long-term fashion. That is the advantage of a National Security Council. So I think, but it should meet more often. But whether it hampers national security decision making day to day, no. As I said, the Cabinet Committee on Security meets. National Security Advisor is already, as you said, he is very much in charge and focused, and large number of decisions are being taken. So that part really works. But where I personally feel that so that a deeper analysis, deeper thinking happens, more stakeholders, and we also take up issues which are on the horizon or beyond the horizon, that I think can be very nicely done in the National Security Council, and it should meet more often.
One related criticism, Dr. Gupta, is that a lot of national security powers are today vested in the PMO, concentrated in the PMO and in the NSA. For example, this government did not even appoint an NSAB, National Security Advisory Board, for 2 years after it's coming into power. So is there any merit in that criticism that too much of national security power is concentrated in the PMO itself and it should be more diversified?
Look, this is a general point. It is not just about national security. Prime Minister's office in this country has always played an important role, particularly from the time of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. That's now almost 45, 50 years ago. Prime Minister has to play an important role. So I don't take this thing too seriously that Prime Minister's office concentrates all the powers. Prime Minister's office is always in touch with all the ministries and departments, and there is a very healthy to and fro that happens, consultations that happens, and as I said, the National Security Advisor, who is a part of the PMO, he has his own ecosystem which has been built. So I will not go into this issue because that's more like a style of functioning of a particular leader. The issue is whether there is a delay or there is a, we must bring in efficiency. If Prime Minister's office can bring in efficiency and if it can sort out issues, why not do that? And ultimately everything goes to Cabinet Committee on Security, and which means the Cabinet Secretary also gets involved in this system because he is the Cabinet Secretary, deals with the entire Cabinet. But that's why this SPG is there, Strategic Policy Group, which is headed by the Cabinet Secretary and which all the security agencies also sit. So that's also part that has been thought through the system. So system is pretty large. The issue is that we should be able to take decisions. It doesn't matter how you take it, but there is enough consultation in the government that happens. In fact, sometimes you might say that too much consultation that happens and that sometimes delays the decisions. But this is a democracy. We have to take everybody on board. We have to build consensus and we have to look at every issue that is raised. So I think this is, and that is where sometimes PMO comes. If the delays are too many, then perhaps the PMO's status and power that can sort out the delays.
I do understand the efficiency argument, but it is also important to invest in processes and in institutions. For example, that you did not appoint an NSAB for 2 years, and you've been quite positive about the NSAB in the book. The fact that they have produced papers and that is populated by a lot of people from academy and from think tanks, etc. So it's also, I mean, while you're taking decisions, it is also important to strengthen the processes.
Absolutely right. And NSAB, so when the new government came, it was looking at the efficacy of the various institutions. So there was some discussion about how we should, see whether things are working. And the new government also took some time. So I think it's, and anyway, the delay was not too much. I mean, sometimes even in the previous NSABs, there have been a delay of 6 months, 8 months, sometimes a year also. It was not too much of a delay, but I think the NSAB was restructured and it's working slightly differently from the earlier NSABs.
That's right. You've been secretary in the National Security Council Secretariat. Could you sort of try and explain to our viewers the role that is being played by the NSCS in the country's national security system?
See, as the NSC system was designed, the National Security Council Secretariat was meant to be a secretariat to the National Security Council, and it is really also providing inputs to the National Security Advisor. And also as NSCS, it is also a secretariat to the SPG group. So all the various institutions that were set up under the NSC, they are all handled, the secretarial inputs and assistance is provided by the NSCS. That's point one. The second is, it is also, it has a number of experts, etc. And there are a number of divisions which have been mentioned here. Now, it is the NSCS which does the nitty-gritty of, identifying an issue, collating inputs, preparing its assessments, running it through the various departments, bringing all of them together in a consultative process, preparing notes for the consideration of the NSA, for the SPG, for NSC, looking at for a large number of task forces. Then, as you said, there is also a huge amount of diplomacy, security diplomacy which is going on. So, preparing for that security diplomacy, preparing and taking input from the Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Defence, etc. So, there is a huge amount of coordination work that the NSCS does. And in the process, also provides its own views and assessments.
How effective has the NSCS been in coordinating policies with various other departments, Home Ministry or MEA or Defence Ministry for that matter?
In my experience, I have spent 11 years in the NSCS, first as Joint Secretary and then as Secretary here. It is an extremely important organization and it's busy all the time. And we have not only these ministries, the MOD or the MEA that you mentioned, the NSCS has also been in touch with a large number of non-traditional ministries as well. For instance, we were in touch with education, with the power, with the telecom, with METI, all the dealing with cyber, sometimes even with the state governments. Also in the context of NSAB, because the NSCS was providing inputs or assistance to NSAB, in that context also with the strategic community of in India, so think tanks. It also has some small research budget, so it was also funding some studies. The NSCS also brings in large number of experts for almost weekly talks, if not weekly, at least twice or thrice a month, all kinds of talks. When big issues erupt, you want to have inputs from various people within the government, outside the government, that too. Then the Deputy National Security Advisor, he is also into the diplomacy part. A lot of cyber diplomacy is being done there. The National Cyber Security Coordinator is part of the NSCS. So coordinating India's policies on cyber issues, looking at cyber technology industry for instance, or looking at space issues, looking at intelligence issues. So all these issues are dealt with at a working level in the NSCS. So it's a huge role.
So the NSCS staff sort of try and come out with these papers under the supervision of this Joint Secretary and submits it to the Secretary. And what happens to those papers?
But it's fairly flat, the NSCS is a small organization. Right. So the distance between the Joint Secretary and the Secretary is hardly any distance. They're working as a team. Right. What happened to these papers? Many things happen to these papers. As I said, many of these papers are exploratory in nature. They're picking up a subject. They take sometimes a long time to develop into a decision making. But in the end, these papers, the fully mature papers, they go to the SPG, which is headed by the Cabinet Secretary, and where it gets into the system. So, okay, suddenly somebody, because SPG has about more than probably a dozen secretaries who are represented in that. So, say, okay, now then cyber security, we ought to be doing this. So, what is METI doing? So, it gets into the official system. Then you have, say, as I said, issues of water, for instance. Say, our relationship, our diplomacy on water with various countries. This is something
that's very revolutionary for a security agency to look at.
Yes. And in fact, maximum work in the government is being done there, because the concerned ministry will look at, okay, I have a discussion, let's say with Pakistan on Indus water treaty, etc. So this is what we have generated. But you have to take a future thing. Should you continue? Should you not do it? What should you do, etc. So you prepare. I mean, if you find something which needs to be added to existing policies, NSCS is the place. NSCS is the one which will identify that, and that is the one which will go to the various policymakers.
In the preface of your book, Dr. Gupta, you write, in recent years there has been a tendency to politicize the actions of the armed forces. An example of this was the politicization of the Indian Army's surgical strikes against the terrorist launch pads in Pakistan in 2016. Political parties freely used the Army's name in their election campaigns ahead of the state assembly elections in Uttar Pradesh in 2017. This is a dangerous tendency which needs to be curbed. You call it a trend, not a one-off incident. Why do you call it a trend and not a one-off incident, and how worrying is this? As a professional, you've been a strategic thinker, you've been a practitioner. How do you look at it objectively?
I think we should nip it into the bud. It should not happen often. And as you can see, the public debates, not only in this issue, but so many other issues, people are talking too loosely about the armed forces. The debates are often ill-informed, sometimes they are motivated, and I'm trying to warn here, please don't do that. It is the security institutions should be kept outside the political debates. You see, unless we build a political consensus on our national security, what are our national security challenges, how we should deal with them, unless we do that, we will be harming ourselves. This was not earlier it was on foreign policy and on national security, there used to be a general consensus. But as a professional and as a citizen, I feel a little disturbed that people talk about these things very loosely now. So that is the point that I was trying.
Let me probe that a little more. So when you say that national security agencies or armed forces should be kept out of such political discussions, what you are trying to say, please correct me if I am wrong, what you are trying to say is that politicization, unnecessary partisan politicization of these institutions should not take place. You are not saying that in a democracy like ours, we should not be discussing or critiquing the policies of the government.
No, there is no question of, this is an open country, this is a democratic country, etc. And we should be looking at this. The purpose of writing this book is precisely this. But let this be informed debate. And let there be a consensus building on this. You see, the point is we are not working towards a consensus building. And a lot of our political debates are, very partisan debates. And also, I think there is, in the earlier times, the ruling party would reach out to the opposition parties. There would be debate in the parliament, and finally decisions would be arrived at, and these will be national decisions. So let us build national consensus and let us take them as national institutions. Otherwise, politicizing would only weaken them.
One of the things that comes out very clearly in the book, Dr. Gupta, is the need for empowering the National Security Council. How do you suggest that India should go about empowering the National Security Council?
See, one is that I think it should be brought into the transaction of business rules, etc. So there is a clear definition of that. That is number one. Secondly, we have decided that it is totally an advisory body. So if it is an advisory body, then somebody may listen to your advice or may not listen to advice. So I think there should be some way of looking at where does the advice stop and where does a decision taken. As you yourself noted, ultimately there is no difference between CCS and the NSC, and it's only a question of certain procedures. But I think there can be many ways in which we can do it. Then other thing is we should strengthen these institutions. I think that's also very important. And I also feel that we should take these institutions to the states as well. Though, because many of our states, they are bordering states. They are affected by many, both internal security and external security affects them. So can we think of a system in which, in consensus building on national security, these states, the chief ministers, the state apparatus, the state institutions are also brought in. Right now it is pretty much a central government enterprise. As I said, a little bit of contact and connection is there, but can we institutionalize that? That is another thing we can do. Another very important suggestion which is there in the book and which has also been talked about is, today national security is a composite whole. So many disciplines go into it. Experts. You see, national security is not simply a question of a soldier being trained. It is the people who are, let's say, experts in cyber security, in computers, space, and so many other things. Now, we don't have expertise. So, can we build a cadre of national security experts who have some knowledge about those disciplines which go into national security? It could be, as I mentioned, it could be computers, cyber, for instance, IT, big data analytics. It could be even forensics. It could be how you deal with satellites. And in the case of non-traditional security issues, we should be having experts on energy, on water, on terrorism, and so on. So we need a cadre, and I'm suggesting in this book that we should have a cadre, a few hundred people perhaps, and which could then be posted in different ministries and departments and maybe even in states. And there could be a proper recruitment process, a well thought out recruitment process, and perhaps it can be run by the National Security Advisor himself. So this is one suggestion that has.
In fact, in the book you mentioned, you talk about the importance of a specialized national security cadre involving domain experts, amending the allocation of business rules, creation of INDU, the Indian National Defence University, Ministry of National Security, for example. What is the status of thinking in the government about some of these things? These are very revolutionary and very important steps. So what is the state of thinking in the government?
Well, some of this is happening. For instance, INDU, that was conceptualized many years ago, and it's essentially going through the act has to be passed through the parliament. So something always holds it back, but I hope that happens. And on other issues, I think the ideas have still to mature. Something will happen, I hope, but we are still at the early stages of thinking.
Dr. Gupta, you do argue in the book that besides empowering the National Security Council, we also need several more national security institutions. For example, you did mention the issue of the Counter-Terrorism Center and perhaps an agency to coordinate maritime security issues. But you mentioned earlier on in the interview that we have so many institutions. Now, is it a question of a lack of institutions, or is it a question of the importance or the need for more coordination? What is the real issue?
I think coordination here is more important, and sometimes you need a totally new institution as well. Like we created the National Cyber Security Coordinator. That was needed. So we need not be too rigid in this. We can, when required, you should build an institution. But I agree. It is the existing institutions where they need to be better synergized, coordinated, equipped, both their manpower requirements, their financial resources, and all these need to be taken into account. But the most important part is the coordination part, which I think, which is what the National Security Council can do and should do. Newer institutions, which are essentially coordinating institutions, that can be created. I can give you an example, for instance, say the case of, let's say, strategic minerals. Now, strategic minerals have never been really thought about as a national security issue. But after this rare earth thing happened in China in 2010 and they stopped it, and then you also realize that in your the entire defense and strategic industry, let's say aerospace or the satellites, etc., depends on the use of strategic minerals. So we have a minerals and mining department, but it doesn't look at it as a strategic minerals from the point of national security. And when you looked at the problem of national strategic minerals, you realize that there are many institutions, maybe about 20-30 institutions, which require to be brought together. So on a day-to-day basis, who will do that? So very often the model that is suggested for India is that of the Atomic Energy Commission or the Space Commission, which was set up many years ago. And they are the people who then have their own ecosystem in which they think through, they take decisions, they have experts, etc. And all their inputs are ultimately where they're coming. They're coming to the National Security Council.
On page 342 of your book, you write, the work culture in the government is still tuned to tactical rather than strategic thinking. An active NSC would help turn up the government machinery and compel government departments to take a holistic view of national security. In other words, you are saying that there is still no holistic view on national security in the country. Is it still evolving? How worrying is it? Should we be worried?
Surely, I mean, National Security Council, when it was set up precisely for this purpose. And it has, as I said, made some progress. But the way things are changing, I mean, what we did not hear just 3-4 years ago, what is big data analytics? Which means we should expect more and more changes, and that's why we need to do more strategic thinking. So the one key argument in this book is that we must not get bogged down, and even National Security Council should not get bogged down with nitty-gritty. That is something which is done by the various ministries, etc. We must take a strategic view of national security.
Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.